Welwitschia. This is the cover of a book entitled Welwitschia, published in 1978 by Chris H. Bornman, showing a picture of the plant. The Austrian botanist and explorer Friedrich Welwitsch, 1806 to 1872, is quoted in the book as stating when he discovered the plant in 1859, "I am convinced that what I have seen is the most beautiful and majestic that tropical South Africa can offer." This is a clipping from a newspaper dated September 1963 entitled, "He's Shipping It Home. Pomona Scientist Finds Prehistoric African Plant." Windhoek, South Africa. A 3-day search in the desolate Namib Desert has secured for Pomona College in Claremont, California, a rare prehistoric type plant. The plant, Welwitschia bainesi, was found by the botanist Professor Lyman Benson of Pomona. Surprised and happy, he learned the South African government had given permission for the plant to be flown to Pomona. The plant is estimated to be 400 years old and weigh about 50 pounds. His plant is believed to be the first natural specimen for Welwitschia ever to be sent to America. It is found in its natural state only in the Namib Desert. Most overseas botanists who would like to obtain specimens are put off by the remoteness of the Namib. Benson, who attended the Golden Jubilee of the Kirstenbosch Botanical Garden in Cape Town, made a special detour to southwest Africa to see the Welwitschia in its natural state. Some Welwitchias are believed to be several thousand years old. As shown on this map, Namibia is located on the southwest coast of Africa. This is a black and white map of Namibia showing more detail. One can see that Walvis Bay is located on the coast, as is the Namib Desert, where this video was taken and where we saw the Welwitschia. Abe and I had a wonderful trip to Namibia in 2014 with our friends Karen Clark from England and Kathy Gaudette, who is an American citizen but has lived and worked in Uganda for many years. We were very fortunate to have our English friend, Malcolm Wilson, as our guide. Malcolm is a very experienced ranger and birder and has lived and worked for many years in Uganda and other African countries. We are very grateful to Malcolm for arranging the trip and being our guide on this amazing adventure. There was never a dull moment. We begin this video by showing the landscape as we drive out of Walvis Bay into the Namib Desert to see the Welwitschia.
Last night, but it was probably just a touristy type of thing. Camels originated where?
All beach.
We're driving out of Walvis.
So you're going to have a coalescence between Walvis and Swakop. It's just going to be one continual mass. There'll be shops coming out here, shopping malls.
Yeah.
They're building it up. The land looked like this before they started building all these housing developments. We just passed it. We're going further north.
It's still easy to.
Along the way, we made a few interesting stops, which we have included. This is a guano platform. They build this, and then the birds come and keep pooping on it. And over a period of time, then they scrape it off, and it's called guano.
And when it gets wet, what happens?
When it gets wet. No, it's you know, our wetness, you know, it doesn't happen.
So you wouldn't have enough rain
there's
for
no
it
problem.
to...
Malcolm has a very acute eye and frequently spotted and identified birds that we were unable to even see until we looked through our binoculars. Frequently, he brought the vehicle to a sudden stop to either point out or pick up a creepy crawly like a chameleon, snake, or other creature. How can you get its mouth open? So you weren't afraid. I thought you really... What is it called now?
Chameleon.
nasty bite.
Really?
Cool.
Can you hold him down?
He's going black. He was quite bright when I
So they change color. Oh, you're right. That
didn't
kind
know it, mate, but we're saving your life.
Yeah, he was crossing the road, was he?
Find him somewhere.
Look how dark he's turning.
Okay, sorry.
Do you think it's his reflection?
No, anything going. Beautiful animal. Turn into a blue plaque.
The white is hydrogen, yeah, so it absorbs the sun. Oops.
We should take him with us.
Is he like, he's like the ones in Nairobi, more of a horn.
Three horn
Yeah.
Jacksons.
Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Did I tell you what the old had a big cage? I should give it a cage and keep it on a big. This was, you know, they had trees and bushes and things in it for them.
Okay.
Great, well done. Well spot.
So then there's turn-offs off of this road, right? So you just got to look for those signs.
Today, the Namib-Naukluft National Park, Naukluft meaning narrow ravine in German, whose original nucleus was founded in 1907 by the German colonial administration and was later enlarged, is today one of the largest protected national areas of the African continent, 49,768 square kilometers. This sign reads, "Consider the environment, no vehicles beyond this point." The landscapes are really breathtaking. The region is characterized by high and isolated rock formations called Inselbergs or kochas. The latter is apparently an Afrikaans word that means isolated desert mountains, formed by red granite rocks, while the easternmost part of the park is formed by Naukluft Mountains. The Namib Desert, which takes up most of the territory of the park, is probably the oldest desert on Earth, having an age of about 80 million years. This huge sea of dunes extending from north to south along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean for over 1,600 kilometers and from west to east to a depth ranging between 50 and 160 kilometers. Winds are largely responsible for shaping the Namib dunes, called Barchan or crescent-shaped dunes, whose color indicates their age, because the iron content in the sand with time oxidizes, creating the characteristic red-orange color of the sand dunes of the Namib. The dunes of the Namib Desert are highest in the world. They are over 300 meters high above the surrounding desert plain. A surprising high number of forms of life is able to survive in this extremely arid area. Among them include hyenas, jackals, oryx, snakes, beetles, and other insects, while many varieties of birds are found near the rare temporary pools of water. The rare rains, which average around 10 millimeters a year, sometimes brings a little relief to the soil, which is completely dry for the rest of the year. Although the fog that forms in the early morning in the nearby Atlantic Ocean regularly brings a certain amount of moisture. Here, this is a park. It's supposed to be preserved. You have to even have permits to come in here. See that? Let's see where they've started drilling. Looking for oil.
But it's funny how. Well, they're here as well, look. No.
So this is what they're doing to the national park.
Doesn't strike me as an environmentally concerned citizen.
In the pipeline.
Oh, you've seen one. You've seen him over
pictures. The truck coming through the paintings park. Another truck coming through. As soon as possible. Safety lot coming through here. Plants. We have finally arrived at the area of the Namib Desert where the Welwitschia plants are located. Welwitschia mirabilis. Mirabilis means marvelous, amazing, or remarkable. And indeed, it is very remarkable. The full botanical scientific name is Welwitschia mirabilis, Hook F. family, Welwitchiaceae. The valid botanical name was first provided by the son of the famous botanist William Jackson Hooker. The son, whose name was Joseph Dalton Hooker, was also a botanist. This magnificent specimen is more or less typical of the plants that were first encountered by white travelers and scientists. One point we especially want to emphasize here is that they were not totally aware of all the special features of the plant. The plant was, after all, rather different from what they normally encountered when they observed other plants in their travels or botanizing. To give a bit of a flavor of how they saw the plant, or interpreted what they saw, I am going to read an account that was written in the 1860s. Notice the uncertainty accompanying some aspects of the description of this new find. Quote, I noticed another large root or stem, something like a bulb having a rough bark like the oak, with long, broad, wavy coils of fibrous leaves, 15 or 20 feet long, with scarlet flowers and seed pods like small fir cones. These plants, which have a very long taproot, weigh sometimes upward of 200 weight, meaning over a couple of 100 pounds. I observed it has but 2 leaves, which, however, are split up, imparting the appearance of there being several. The top of the plant is flat, of an oblong form, and 1 leaf springs from near each edge out of a longitudinal rent, meaning opening or split. And the cones or flowers grow from branching stems along the margin and sometimes under the leaves. The circumference of some of these root stems is from 6 to 8 feet at least. End quote. We begin by my giving you a brief overview showing our original video of the area and the plants. Following this introduction, Abe will give a much more detailed description of the plants. Although Malcolm had not originally made plans to visit this area of the Namib Desert, he changed our itinerary when we expressed interest in seeing the Welwitschia. Fortunately, we were able to see, video, and photograph these plants in their natural environment. Over to the side was a fenced-off area in which the original mother plant was located. A sign on the fence reads, "This plant is approximately 1,500 years old. It has surface-feeding roots, and trampling of the sand around its base will disturb the contact between the roots and the fog-dampened upper layers. Please stay outside the enclosure and help to preserve one of the rarest plants in the world." Unfortunately, you can see graffiti has been scratched on the sign. A staircase was provided so that we could climb up and look down on the female mother plant in the protected area. Other than this very general information on the graffiti-defaced sign, there was no other information about what botanists or biologists call growth habit of the specimen. The term growth habit in botany refers to the shape, height, appearance, and form of a plant species. The plant growth pattern derives from its inherent genetics, as well as physical factors that exist during its growth. All this contributes to its final appearance. One of the many interesting things about the Welwitschia is that the plants are either female or male. From what we have just shown, I doubt that many would be able to figure out much about the plant. Abe will now discuss the plant in more detail.
In the process of trying to think about what I might say about the morphology, I was thinking about the past and how little I really knew about Welwitschia until my first year as a graduate student at Cornell in the botany department. At that time, we had a visitor named Robert Rodin, R-O-D-I-N. He had come to Cornell Botany on leave from, I believe it was the San Luis Obispo campus of the California State College system. He had done his doctorate at Berkeley under a well-known botanist named Adriance Foster. Now, Adriance Foster was well known at Cornell since he was an undergraduate student in botany there, and he'd actually done his master's degree there as well, and had proceeded to Harvard where he got his doctorate studying under the well-known botanist I.W. Bailey, who trained many of the people at that time, including the professor of anatomy and morphology at Cornell, Arthur Johnson Eames, under who Adriance Foster had done his master's degree. In any case, Bob Rodin was a very pleasant, affable, and very outgoing man who helped students a lot, and we all liked him a great deal. He had gone as a young student as part of a Berkeley expedition, as it were, to southern Africa. That was around 1947. And he became fascinated in Welwitschia, did some collecting, brought back seeds, and did his doctorate, which I think it was completed in 1951, on the seedling anatomy and morphology. So that ends up being sort of what you call a genealogical history of Bob Rodin, and how I was able to learn firsthand from someone who had studied the plant and was actually still studying it, because he had deliberately taken leave from San Luis Obispo to go to Cornell and to spend time going through the details. He apparently felt very comfortable going back to the alma mater of his own PhD mentor, Adriance Foster. Foster used to go by the nickname of Ed Foster. He trained many, many students at Berkeley who went on their way and did their own excellent work. Bob supplied me with some slides of Welwitschia that he had taken while in what was then Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And he also sent me a map, and I used to use this at Stony Brook in teaching some botanical lectures on plants of the world that were rather weird or unusual or spectacular or attention-getting, what have you. So that's how I got to know a little bit about Welwitschia. It was actually firsthand from someone who had studied it from a very early period. We're going to return to a bit of the map at this moment, because it will show you that the first encounter with Welwitschia as a plant was done in 1859 by the Austrian botanist. He was a doctor of medicine and an explorer named Friedrich Martin Joseph Welwitsch. He lived from 1806 to 1872. So he was about 53 years old when he first encountered what we now call Welwitschia. He had been engaged by the King of Portugal and the government of Portugal to do an exploration of the fairly newish colony of Angola. The fact is that actually in the 1500s, the Portuguese had taken over the area that we now know as Angola. But Welwitsch actually came across the plant. He only knew it by the then native name for it and was completely fascinated with it. Welwitsch was an interesting guy about whom we won't say much, except it might be surprising for some to learn that he's buried in London, England. He initially was trained as a lawyer, as his father had wanted him to do. He switched out into medicine, got bored with medicine, became interested in plants and natural history, including zoology, and really seems to have had a little bit of an itchy foot and liked to travel, and that's how he ended up in Angola. The plants that he encountered were not in Namibia. Namibia didn't exist then, and as we said, it was part of Southwest Africa. As you go down the coast, you'll see that there are various sites where various botanists have done collecting, and Bob Rudin had done collecting in, I think it was the area of 7 or so, and it's not very far from where we visited and did our little mini exploration, about which you'll hear more later. You've seen the overall desert area, and we'll pick up on the thread before too long and go into some of the details. The plant has been called the ugliest plant in the world because it's scraggly, shredded looking, looks like a heap of rubble for some people. Some have called it the botanical octopus. It's certainly one of the most bizarre and grotesque plants found on this planet. Charles Darwin apparently called it the platypus of the plant kingdom. Sort of a living fossil, as it were. So Welwitschia now is pretty well known, and it's amazing how many studies have been done on it. And here it is, going from a plant that's virtually unknown to one that's become super studied. It's got a number of things about it that make it very worthwhile studying, not only the plant anatomy and morphology, but the fact that it can cope in desert conditions using adaptations that are considered rather rare for desert plants. In other words, it's not a succulent, which is one of the main supposed techniques for surviving desert conditions. The roots are, about 1 meter deep, but the taproot is not one of these incredibly deep roots. So here it is, a plant in the desert that has more or less average depth roots, enabling it to survive. The leaves are, as I said, not succulent, but they do have, probably, it's been estimated, more stomata, or stomates, the little mouths, as they say in Greek, that enable gases and moisture to enter into the plant body. So this is one of the adaptations that it has. So the hope is to learn more and more about the ecology of the plant, understand how it adapts, and in that way understand what strategies might be adopted to enable desertification or more severe desert conditions, which are sure to occur worldwide, to enable plants to survive. We're going to divert attention now to a little bit of a discussion on the morphology of Welwitschia. And recall that I said it was named Welwitschia after discoverer. One of the native names for the Welwitschia plant was apparently Ntumbo or Ut Tijumbo, which apparently means stump or stump-like. And the initial note from Welwitsch to the botanist Hooker at Kew, Royal Botanic Gardens in England, was that it should be given the botanical generic name of Tumboa. But they decided against that. They thought it was an important enough find, so they decided to name it after Dr. Welwitsch. Now, the interesting thing about Welwitschia is, like some plants, not that many, it's technically called dioecious. And I used to tell students that dioecious really comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning household. So there's two households, one female, one male. We're going to show a closer up of the female and male plants. To begin with the female, you can see that the strobili are quite in evidence. And to help interpret these a little bit, we have longitudinal sections and drawings made from the longitudinal sections. The left shows it in a broader perspective and in absolute section on the right-hand side. That'll give you a good idea of what these cones or strobili look like. Now again, the male strobili, or the microsporophylls, you can see the sexual organs more accurately protruding and a much more enlarged section showing what they look like. So the pollen is produced here. It's either wind and or insect transferred to the female. Fertilization occurs. Seed development progresses. The seeds are shed when the sporophylls open up. Now the difference between the first ones that we saw when we first described dioecious was that they were a bit younger. The ones that we have now looked at are a bit more mature. Now this is as good a place as any to pay attention to the botanical classification of Welwitschia. Of course, it's in the kingdom Plantae, or plants, and it's in the subkingdom Tracheophyta, which means the plants that have vessels to transport water. And it's in the division Spermatophyta, which means it's seed-bearing. It's in the class Gymnospermae, and the order Netales. Now, Netum, Gnetum, in Ephedra, Ephedra, or Ephedra, depending on how you want to say it, and Welwitschia are in the Netales. The family is Welwitchiaceae, and the genus is Welwitschia, and the species is mirabilis. So here we have a plant, Welwitschia mirabilis, which is in its own family, and it's one of the group that was called the Netales. Now the problem is that's kind of old-fashioned, as I put it. That's the system under which people of my generation grew up. But there's, like in every area, revisionism and modification and extension and expansion based on new knowledge. Now Carolus Linnaeus, or Carl von Linné, who was Swedish, and the father of nomenclature scientifically, classified botanical writers in books with quite a lot of thoroughness. And he classified plants and animals in detail, but he also classified the people who wrote books and talked about these things. He came up with 46 types, and he actually published this in 1751 in one of his books. He talked about the collectores, or the gatherers, and the methodici, or the classifiers, which included the nomenclatores, or the namers, and so on. Now, there's one group that he didn't know about, and some botanists joked about it, And that was that if he knew about it, he would have come up with another one called the litigatories or the litigators, because they were dominant and invariably aggressive in their interest in making laws and in breaking the laws. So now this whole business of plant classification or taxonomy is something that I don't pretend to know much about. It's a career for many botanists. But the point is that we used to joke about them being either lumpers or splitters. In other words, they tended to pile things together based on relationships that were real or imagined or surmised or speculated as being real. And the splitters, that was to say people who were willing to break things up ad infinitum based on minor points. So it depended in general on what group you came from. Now the point that I want to make is that as techniques improve and more knowledge is gained, people are willing to try to reclassify things, put them forward in different ways. And we put one table forward, which I think is quite interesting, in that it gives a timeline based on the early period of 1920, 1935, 1965, 1984, and we haven't done anything much more recent than that, but the point is that you'll see how the presumed relationships have become modified, the names that go with them have been changed, and on and on and on. So it doesn't do any good except to keep in mind that in terms of Welwitschia, like all plants, it can have a shifting history, and therefore what I've said isn't, as I jokingly say, the word of God necessarily. There's a lot of new information, and new information that can always find exception to the rule. I mentioned this business of Welwitschia roots not theoretically being all that deep. Well, Gillian Cooper Driver, retired from Boston University, who incidentally was a lab technician from Cambridge, England, when I was a student, she ended up doing some studies that proved that some plants, at least, of Welwitschia, had roots that were many meters deep. One of the other things that I've not even touched on and won't is that the photosynthetic pattern of Welwitschia has been studied, not in enough detail, but some detail, and they've come up with the terminology CAM or CAM plants, standing for crassulation acid metabolism plants. In this scheme, the stomates, the little mouths as I said in Greek, close during the day, but they're open at night. So when they're closed during the day, not much water is lost, and then when the fog comes in from the seacoast, and we never saw the fog because we weren't there at the right time of day, the moisture can get into the plant and photosynthesis proceeds. So the whole pattern is topsy-turvy. Again, it doesn't do us any good here because we've just spent a mini expedition and we haven't studied in the lab ourselves. So we're just trying to give a general idea of what's going on. Now, as mentioned, new information is constantly gotten, and investigators feel more confidence in working out relationships that were tentative or not even thought up at the time, end up making an attempt to get things into a proper, broader context. Even then, there are a lot of blanks, and one would hope that as time goes on, the blanks get filled in. This newish scheme, we said earlier, the 1984 one was probably the more end point. Well, now here it is 2004, which is still 16, 20 years ago. We can see that some daring scientists have attempted to come up with a broader scheme. So here we have it. And one can't really predict, but maybe this will fall into concrete one day and we'll say, oh yes, that's the point at which the new knowledge became solidified and we're going to work therefrom. But in any case, this is how knowledge is gotten and how it's interwoven and integrated to the broad scheme. Now we've spent some time discussing how the fluidity of nomenclature and taxonomy occurs and how things change and are modified as new knowledge or speculation comes into being. We now divert our attention to those things which are much less fluid. They're fixed in concrete, as I put it, and it deals with the rules of botanical nomenclature. This scheme shows the Welwitschia family, and it is the family to which Welwitschia belongs. This gives you the rundown on how it came into being in what is called a valid format. It was first published by someone named Krikorian in the New Journal of Botany in Italy, the Nuovo Giornale Botanica Italiana, in 1879. It further says that it's a nom cons, N-O-M period, C-O-N-S period, nomen conservandum. It means it's a kept name. In other words, it will not be modified. It's been agreed upon. The type genus in the family is Welwitschia, and this is followed by Hook F, 1862. Now you have to understand that this talks about Joseph Dalton Hooker, the son, or the filius in Latin, of John Dalton Hooker. So Joseph Dalton Hooker in 1862 gave a proper write-up. It was validated, in other words, it was confirmed by a diagnosis in Italian. And that, in turn, was published in yet another Italian journal, a quite old one, which dealt with the Society of the Lynx, which meant that the members were reputedly very, very acute in their vision, and that was put out in 1881. Again, the diagnosis was in Italian. The family named was completely attributed to a German named Mark Graf, and it was published in Engler and Prantl in a German comprehensive work called The Natural Plant Families in the second edition in 1926. Mark Graf provided a description in German, etc. So we see here now that scheme on the family. And this goes on and on with all the other families. And at this point in time, they're not going to be superseded. The type genus from which the name of the family derives is set. It's Welwitschia. Others might be added, we doubt it, but in fact, that would still be in the Welwitschia family. Again, we're not specialists. We're just trying to give you an idea that even though things are fluid and subject to change, certain things are not. Priority is all important here. Who did what, when, and first, and did it properly? Now, the thing that's very interesting to me is that the plant looks disheveled, very untidy, and the leaves look shredded because they shred lengthwise. In that way, they end up looking very multiple-leaved. Well, it looks multiple-leaved. Anyone who looks at the plant said, my God, how many leaves are there? It's just a gnarled mess. Well, the fact is that it is, in fact, technically made up of 2 leaves. There are, in the early stages, on some of the specimens that we can see, two olive green, leathery, actually woody to the touch leaves that sprawl in a tangled mass, bringing to mind the designation octopus-like. The leaves are slowly perpetuated from what is called basal meristem. Now, basal meristems are interesting too, in that they are, as it suggests, lowermost or basal, and they're located in the stem's terminal groove. The basal meristem, located in this terminal groove, in older plants it looks like it's in a shallow basin. And the beauty of a basal meristem is that it allows growth, much like it allows a grass with a basal meristem to grow, so that it can be mowed or clipped regularly from the top and continue to grow from the bottom. The growth rates of the leaves of Welwitschia have been measured, and the rough estimate is between 100 to 200 millimeters a year, probably closer to the 200. The amount of living tissue associated with a given leaf, though, varies tremendously. But as a generality, one can say there's not that much of a leaf that's alive relative to its overall length. That's why so much of it looks like a trash heap. Now, I've attempted to emphasize that Welwitschia is more than a bit of an anomaly in the plant kingdom. And, as I've also attempted to emphasize throughout my commentary, very little about the plant's growth pattern is obvious. It's not obvious to the casual observer, and it's really not that much more obvious to a trained botanist. The shoot apex or stem tip is the seat of all of this anomaly, or at least most of it. It's really quite aberrant. After forming two cotyledons, and you remember cotyledons are seed leaves, and the two leaves deriving and coming into being from the region of these cotyledonary leaves, the stem tip meristem stops or ceases functioning. Now, we see here in longitudinal microscopic section two cotyledonary leaves. The center portion shows the soon-to-die stem tip area. The red arrow at the upper right shows the point of real leaf insertion, and I put that in quotes. The word insertion is used even though it's actually the emergence of the real leaf that will continue to grow from a basal meristem. The so-called basal meristem is actually more precisely called an intercalary or intercalary basal meristem. Intercalary in botany meaning something that is interposed between its starting point and its product or daughter cells. These daughter cells give rise to the growing and very persistent leaf at the base of the leaf. To that extent, it actually may be more accurate or helpful to understanding the leaf relative to its basal meristem to use the full name intercalary basal meristem, since it conveys the idea of the continuous production of daughter cells being cranked out from there. Above the longisection, we see a view from the inside of the basin, that rough, gnarled, bumpy area that we're seeing in very dark, almost black in some of our pictures. It is the condemned, and that's a term that's frequently used, it's condemned, soon to cease functioning, followed by death, of the stem tip meristem that is covered and buried under this thick layer of tissue. That is where the shallow basin comes from. You may recall seeing in a few of the previous views of the basin area the emergence of the female cone, or strobili, S-T-R-O-B-I-L-I, recall, from the basal crest or marginal ridge from the basal meristem region. The same holds true, of course, for the male microsporophylls or male strobili as well. Now I hope this rather lengthy diversion gives a better perspective of the gross morphology of Welwitschia and its business area. As mentioned, one would never, it seems to me, be able to figure this out without some prior exposure and explanation. Hopefully with the background and the in-depth explanation I have given about the growth pattern, you can now figure out how a large old specimen came about. Perhaps use of a couple of very old drawings of considerably younger Welwitschia plants will be useful in our exposition. This drawing was taken from a very old German source and shows a young plant that has produced two large leaves. The one on the right shows splitting at its end. The shallow basin at the top area is an area of arrested growth and appears in this diagram as a depression or even looks crease-like. This area normally represents the location of a stem or shoot tip from which a more ordinary plant species would grow. The shallow basin, as drawn here, shows the presence of the female reproductive structure or cones around the edge. These were produced by meristematic activity around the base of the crest or edges by action of what we have called the basal intercalary meristem. Now note this, the taproot appears rather thick and signs of some branching, but it's been chopped off in the diagram. Since the plant is dioecious, again meaning two households or separate as either female or male plants, the female cones are shown enlarged on the right, the male is shown enlarged on the left. This drawing then is a very simplified early textbook example of the growth of a young Welwitschia, explaining how a very large and very mature specimen grows from this is considerably more complicated. This is another diagram dating from the 1860s that attempts to provide an overview of an older plant. This plant has two leaves, one on either side of an unevenly margined central portion. It almost looks like an uneven disc. Beneath it, there is another diagram in which the leaves have been removed, emphasizing that in side or profile view, it is a depressed, basin-like, top-shaped structure with a substantial ridge around its periphery. The root has been cut off in both the diagrams. While these diagrams show later stages of growth from the first sketch, these are not that detailed either. No reproductive structures are drawn or shown. I'll try to make up for the deficiencies in the drawings with verbal descriptions. We provide some old black and white photos that show some of the significant morphology of the suppressed dead stem tip area that is so important to our understanding of the resultant growth of fully grown and old specimens of Welwitschia. These photos are based in part on the notes of the late George E. Lindsay, 1916 to 2002. He was a PhD from Stanford University and a specialist in cacti and desert plants, and one-time director of the California Academy of Sciences. This image, taken from above, shows the meristematic groove. The basal meristem basin appears broken up due to differences in growth rate. This makes it quite difficult to identify the two leaves of the plant. Arrows have been placed on the photo to show where the leaves have been nibbled or chewed off by some grazing animal, perhaps an oryx. In the next photo, we see that even though the shoot tip is early truncated and dies or is aborted, however one wants to describe it, the stem, now recall the top-shaped or cone-shaped structure we saw in the sketch of the young plantlet, which will become more pear-shaped or more obconate as it grows. Now here's the key point, can increase in girth, the circumference, to at least a few feet or even more. This broadened area can become uneven, again through different rates of growth, and assume a broken up form. The broadened area thus appears very uneven margined or uneven edged, and can even fold in on itself, making it look like a pocket. It becomes very hard under those circumstances to see or figure out where the leaves belong. Finally, again we see the broken up appearance of the basin area due to dissimilar growth rates. The leaves shown here have been grazed or eaten. Notice the incredibly gnarled appearance that leads one to believe that there are many separate leaves when there are not. Now, in closing, I just want to say that one aspect that we haven't touched upon, largely because I don't know that much about it and the data is not that easily obtainable, is that Welwitschia can apparently attain a very great age. Some of these plants are said to be 1,000 years old, 1,500 years old, perhaps even 2,000 years old, which would make them amongst the oldest things alive on Earth. Carbon dating has been attempted. There's no such thing as a tree ring to help date these things. On the other hand, some of the crest or the crown area gives people who have experience a little bit of a handle, but exactly how that handle works or is interpreted, I have yet to myself learn. But at least understand that these plants can reach great ages, and they are therefore amongst the wonders of the plant world.
Following this information on Conscience Films, we include a brief bibliography on Welwitschia, which will scroll slowly. If you need more time to view the references, you can pause the video.